January 27, 2010. Just after sunrise, residents in a quiet neighborhood near Lima, Peru, noticed an old blue sedan that had been sitting in the same spot for hours. At first, no one thought much of it, but when a group of thieves approached the vehicle to steal valuable parts, concerned neighbors alerted the police. Officers arrived expecting to deal with a routine case involving an abandoned car. Instead, they made a discovery that would shock the entire country. Inside the trunk was the body of a 45-year-old woman, whose success, wealth, and reputation made her one of the least likely people anyone would expect to become the victim of a brutal homicide. The victim was Elizabeth Vásquez Marín, a respected tax attorney who had spent years building an impressive legal career. Friends described her as intelligent, generous, and deeply devoted to her family. She owned valuable properties, managed successful businesses, and had earned a fortune through years of dedication and hard work. To investigators, nothing about her personal life suggested she would become the target of such a violent crime. She had no known criminal connections and very few personal conflicts. The biggest mystery was simple but chilling. Who would want to kill a woman whose life appeared so successful and admired by nearly everyone around her? Detectives initially believed the answer might lie in Elizabeth's former husband. During his career, he had served in Peru's justice system and worked on major anti-corruption cases involving influential individuals. Investigators wondered whether someone from his past had decided to seek revenge by targeting a member of his family. It seemed like a reasonable theory, and police spent weeks exploring every possible connection. Yet every interview, document, and lead pointed to the same conclusion. There was no evidence linking his professional enemies to Elizabeth's murder. The investigation had reached a dead end, forcing detectives to begin again from the very beginning. Elizabeth's story did not begin with wealth. She was born into a hard-working family that believed education was the key to a better future. From an early age, she stood out for her discipline and determination. While many of her classmates dreamed of quick success, Elizabeth dedicated herself to becoming a lawyer. Years of study, sacrifice, and persistence eventually paid off. She specialized in tax law, where her sharp legal mind quickly earned the respect of clients and colleagues alike. As her reputation grew, so did her opportunities. What started as a promising career slowly transformed into an extraordinary success story, built entirely through dedication and hard work. Over the years, Elizabeth invested wisely in real estate and business ventures. She purchased apartments, commercial properties, and other valuable assets that steadily increased her wealth. By her mid-40s, she had built an estate worth several $1,000,000, making her one of the most successful attorneys in her field. Yet people who knew her rarely focused on her financial achievements. Instead, they remembered her generosity. Elizabeth often helped relatives, supported family members during difficult times, and believed that success meant sharing opportunities with others. Above everything else, she wanted to create a secure future for the person she loved most, her only daughter. Elizabeth devoted much of her life to giving her daughter opportunities she herself had never enjoyed. She paid for an excellent education, comfortable living, vacations, designer clothing, and anything else she believed would help her child succeed. Friends said Elizabeth wanted her daughter to grow up without experiencing the financial struggles she had faced while building her own career. Every decision she made was driven by love and the hope that her daughter would one day appreciate those sacrifices. Sadly, despite everything Elizabeth provided, the relationship between mother and daughter slowly began to change in ways that no one could have imagined. Several years before the tragedy, Elizabeth's marriage came to an end. Although the divorce was emotionally difficult, she refused to let it define her future. She remained focused on her career, continued expanding her businesses, and eventually found happiness in a new relationship. Those close to her said she seemed optimistic again and was looking forward to a fresh chapter in her life. Plans for another marriage were already taking shape, and for the first time in years, Elizabeth believed the future held peace instead of conflict. But inside her own home, another story was quietly unfolding. one filled with tension, secrecy, and growing resentment. At the center of that growing conflict was her daughter's relationship with a young man named Fernando. The two had met through church, where he appeared polite, respectful, and friendly. At first, Elizabeth welcomed him into the family because she believed everyone deserved encouragement and a chance to succeed. She offered him guidance, introduced him to business opportunities, and even tried to help him establish a stable career. Her kindness came naturally, and she hoped her support would motivate him to build a better future. Instead, investigators later discovered that Fernando had very different ambitions. People who knew Fernando described him as charming on the surface, but unwilling to work for the lifestyle he wanted. Rather than building his own career, he often depended on the financial support of others. Elizabeth gradually realized that many of the opportunities she had provided were being ignored. Jobs were abandoned, responsibilities neglected, and promises repeatedly broken. Eventually, she concluded that Fernando was less interested in creating a future with her daughter than he was in gaining access to the family's wealth. It was a realization that deeply worried her and marked the beginning of serious conflict inside the household. Believing she was protecting her daughter, Elizabeth began distancing Fernando from the family's finances. She reduced the money her daughter received, monitored expenses more carefully, and questioned why valuable items had started disappearing from the apartment. Cash, jewelry, and electronics seemed to vanish without explanation. Every conversation about the missing property ended in denial, leaving trust between mother and daughter badly damaged. What Elizabeth saw as responsible parenting, her daughter increasingly viewed as control. Neither realized these growing arguments were setting the stage for one of Peru's most shocking criminal cases, a tragedy that would soon devastate an entire family. As the months passed, the atmosphere inside Elizabeth's home became increasingly tense. Arguments that had once been rare were now almost routine. Friends and relatives noticed a growing distance between mother and daughter. Elizabeth believed Fernando was manipulating her child, while her daughter became convinced that her mother was trying to control every aspect of her life. The disagreement was no longer just about a relationship. It had become a battle over trust, independence, and money. Neither side was willing to give in, and each confrontation left their relationship more damaged than before. Investigators later learned that Fernando relied heavily on Elizabeth's daughter for financial support. The money meant for university expenses was often spent on him instead. Rent, clothing, meals, and other personal costs were quietly paid using funds provided by Elizabeth. When that money was no longer enough, more valuables began disappearing from the apartment. Elizabeth confronted her daughter several times, hoping honesty would resolve the situation. Instead, every accusation was denied, creating even greater suspicion. The emotional bond that had once defined their family was slowly being replaced by resentment and distrust. Elizabeth refused to believe that her daughter was beyond help. Despite the constant arguments, she continued trying to protect her from what she believed was an unhealthy relationship. She encouraged her to focus on university, distance herself from Fernando, and think carefully about the future. Those close to Elizabeth later said she never stopped acting like a mother. Even during their worst disagreements, her decisions were driven by concern rather than anger. Unfortunately, every attempt to separate the couple only strengthened their determination to stay together, making the conflict inside the family even more intense. Around this time, Elizabeth also began making important legal decisions. She reviewed documents related to her estate and adjusted parts of her financial planning to better protect the future of her family. Friends later recalled conversations in which she admitted feeling uneasy about the situation at home. She couldn't point to one specific threat, but she sensed something was wrong. Looking back after the murder, investigators viewed those decisions differently. What once seemed like ordinary financial planning now appeared to be the actions of someone who feared her growing family conflict might one day become dangerous. On the evening of January 26, 2010, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Elizabeth followed her normal routine and later attended church with members of her family. Witnesses who saw them that evening described nothing unusual. There were no public arguments, no obvious signs of trouble, and no indication that anything was about to happen. After the service ended, everyone returned home. To neighbors and friends, it looked like another ordinary night. But according to investigators, events already set in motion earlier that day were about to change the lives of everyone connected to Elizabeth forever. Back at the apartment, the evening continued quietly. Elizabeth prepared to end her day, while the household helper completed her usual chores in the kitchen. Her daughter moved through the apartment as if everything was normal. Then something happened that investigators would later consider significant. The volume of the television was suddenly turned up much louder than usual. At the time, no one questioned it. Only later did detectives suggest that the loud television may have been intended to cover sounds coming from elsewhere inside the apartment during the attack. Not long afterward, the household helper remembered hearing raised voices followed by cries that sounded like someone calling for help. She wanted to see what was happening, but the apartment's layout and locked areas prevented her from reaching the bedroom quickly. Believing it was another argument between mother and daughter, she remained where she was. It was a decision that would haunt her for years. Investigators later concluded that while those sounds echoed through the apartment, Elizabeth was desperately fighting for her life against people she never expected would betray her. According to forensic evidence presented during the investigation, Elizabeth suffered a violent assault before her death. She received multiple injuries and struggled to defend herself during the attack. Afterward, investigators believed the perpetrators carefully cleaned portions of the apartment in an effort to remove evidence. Bloodstains that had been wiped away were later revealed through forensic testing, confirming that the crime scene had been inside Elizabeth's own home. What appeared peaceful on the surface concealed the evidence of a brutal struggle that had taken place only hours earlier. Before sunrise the following morning, Elizabeth's body was removed from the apartment and placed inside the trunk of her own vehicle. The car was then driven away and abandoned several miles from her home. For hours it remained unnoticed until local residents saw people attempting to remove parts from the unattended vehicle. Concerned that something suspicious was happening, they contacted the police. Officers responded expecting to investigate an abandoned car. Instead, they opened the trunk and discovered the body of the missing attorney, turning an ordinary patrol call into a national murder investigation. News of Elizabeth's death spread rapidly across Peru. Friends, relatives, and colleagues struggled to understand how someone so respected could become the victim of such a horrific crime. Detectives immediately began interviewing everyone connected to her life, searching for any clue that could explain the motive. At first, they focused on professional enemies linked to her former husband's career in the justice system. But as that theory quickly fell apart, investigators were forced to consider a far more disturbing possibility. The answers they were looking for might not be outside the family. They might already be inside it. As investigators interviewed Elizabeth's relatives, friends, and co-workers, one detail quickly stood out. Her daughter gave conflicting accounts of the last time she had seen her mother. In one interview, she claimed she had gone straight to bed after returning home. Later, she changed her story, saying Elizabeth had left the apartment early the next morning before she supposedly received a phone call from kidnappers demanding money. Detectives immediately checked her phone records, expecting to find evidence of the ransom call. Instead, they discovered no such call had ever been made. The kidnapping story had been fabricated, and investigators began questioning every statement she had given. While examining the phone records, detectives noticed frequent communication between Elizabeth's daughter and Fernando before and after the murder. Their conversations continued even as police searched for answers. At the same time, forensic specialists examined the apartment and discovered traces of blood that remained despite an apparent attempt to clean the scene. Witnesses also described hearing cries for help and unusual activity inside the apartment on the night of the attack. Piece by piece, investigators assembled a timeline that no longer supported the idea of a random crime. The evidence increasingly pointed toward a carefully planned act involving people Elizabeth trusted most. Police arrested Fernando for questioning, and after hours of interrogation, he admitted his involvement in the crime. According to investigators, he explained that the original plan had been to stage a kidnapping and demand ransom money. But the scheme changed when they realized Elizabeth's death could provide access to a far larger financial reward. He also identified another man who had allegedly helped carry out the attack. Investigators quickly located and arrested the second suspect, whose statements confirmed many of the details already uncovered through forensic evidence and witness testimony. With the confessions, investigators reconstructed what they believed had happened inside the apartment. Prosecutors argued that the attack had been planned in advance and that each participant played a specific role. Surveillance footage, phone records, forensic evidence, and witness statements all became part of the case presented in court. Elizabeth's daughter continued denying responsibility, insisting she had not intended for her mother to be killed. Her defense claimed she had been manipulated by Fernando. Prosecutors disagreed, arguing that the planning and actions before and after the crime showed clear awareness of what was taking place. The trial lasted for years and became one of Peru's most closely followed criminal cases. Experts in psychology and forensic science testified before the court, while investigators carefully explained the evidence collected during the investigation. Family members described the growing conflict inside Elizabeth's home and the dramatic changes in the relationship between mother and daughter. Prosecutors argued that the motive was driven by greed and the expectation of inheriting Elizabeth's multi-million-dollar estate. The defense continued challenging that conclusion, but the evidence presented throughout the proceedings painted a consistent picture for the court. Eventually, the judges reached their decision. Fernando and his accomplice were convicted for their roles in the murder. Elizabeth's daughter was also found guilty as a co-author of the crime and received a lengthy prison sentence. Although she later filed multiple appeals, maintaining that she had been manipulated and was not fully responsible, the courts repeatedly upheld the convictions. In separate legal proceedings, she was also declared legally unworthy of inheriting any part of her mother's estate. The fortune Elizabeth had spent decades building would never pass to the person prosecutors said had helped plan her death. For Elizabeth's family, however, no verdict could erase the pain of what had happened. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a woman whose generosity had shaped the lives of so many people around her. Years of court hearings, appeals, and inheritance disputes only deepened that suffering. What made the case especially heartbreaking was not only the violence itself, but the betrayal behind it. Investigators believed the greatest danger to Elizabeth had not come from strangers or professional enemies. It had come from people she had welcomed into her own life and tried to help. Today, the case of Elizabeth Vásquez Marín remains one of Peru's most tragic examples of how greed, manipulation, and broken trust can destroy an entire family. Elizabeth dedicated her life to building a successful career and creating opportunities for those she loved. She believed hard work and kindness would protect her family from hardship. Instead, her story ended in unimaginable betrayal. Though the court delivered its verdict years ago, the questions raised by this case continue to resonate. Above all else, Elizabeth deserves to be remembered not for the crime that ended her life, but for the strength, generosity, and determination that defined it.